Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's middle game video I'm going to talk about a very important strategic and positional aspect of the game, and that's weak squares, specifically weak color complexes. I've already made a video on weak squares and outposts, which you could see for a part 2 or part 1 to this video. It depends on how you look at it, but both subjects are important for understanding square weaknesses. And in today's video we are going to talk about multiple weak squares of the same color and how to prevent it, how to play against it, how to emphasize the weakness if your opponent has it, and how to try to dampen the weakness if you have it. For the first few examples, I've set up some random positions on the board just to try and explain what I'm talking about. So, obviously you have dark squares and you have light squares. The thing I would like to emphasize first is that square weaknesses depend on the pawn structure. When all of your pawns are on their original squares, then obviously you don't have any weaknesses. Same goes for a structure like this one. First of all, the bishops are here just to emphasize the importance of squares, of color complexes, because they are easily the best defender and the best exploiter of the color complexes, so I put them on the board. So basically when your pawns are in a solid chain like this, when neither of them has moved, then you have no weaknesses. These pawns are now controlling, the white pawns are controlling b5, c5, d5, e5 and f5, controlling all the key squares. Conversely, all the black pawns are defending the same squares. Now, a weakness occurs as soon as one pawn moves, and that's inevitable. Regardless of which pawn you decide to move, you are going to weaken one color squares. So, for example, if you move the e4 pawn to e5, now all of a sudden, black is still protecting the f5 square and you are not. So you have now created light squared weaknesses. If you move this position back, if you move the c4 pawn to c5, then you are no longer controlling the b5 square. For example, if black plays here, pushing the pawn forward, white plays here, now white no longer has control over f5 or b5 and has weaknesses on b5, f5, e4 and c4. So now moving all of his pawns to the dark squares means that he has light squared weaknesses. Correspondingly, if white plays d5 here, with one single move, he doesn't have control over c5 or e5 anymore. So with this one move, white managed to create 3 dark squared weaknesses. Now we come to the second point. You are going to create a pawn structure depending on which pieces you have and how your pieces are positioned. In this particular position, it makes much more sense to create dark squared weaknesses and to put your pawns on the light squares because you have a dark squared bishop, and obviously freeing up some dark squares for the bishop is going to be very beneficial because now the bishop has much more scope. So the dark squared weaknesses can't be exploited that easily by black in this position because white has a dark squared bishop. Okay, the same thing goes for black. Let's give a move to white and flip the board. In this position, black would obviously want to free up the light squares for his bishop, and correspondingly, good moves might be either e5 or c5, even though e5 weakens control of f5 and weakens the light squares. Why black in this position has the light squared bishop, so it can be hardly exploited by white. Now let's look at the second example. This is also a random position I've set up, and this is just to show you the importance of weaknesses. In this position, white has no weaknesses and no weak color complex. On the other hand, black has a terribly weak dark squared complex. By moving all of his pawns to the light squares, all of these squares have become potential outposts for white and terribly weak squares for black. Let me show you this exact same position with some pieces on the board, also something I've set up. So you can see that black still has these dark squared weaknesses, and usually when you play g6 trying to fianchetto your bishop on g7, a move such as e6 is bad because then you create extra weaknesses. So usually in this setup the black pawns are going to be here, and you're going to have a sort of solid pawn chain. Now what's important about this position? Since black has dark squared weaknesses, that's obvious. White has to exploit them, and an often misconception people have is that if you both have dark squared bishops, and black has dark squared weaknesses, then you shouldn't trade off your bishop for his, because you will have nothing to attack the squares with. It's quite the contrary. You would love to exchange this bishop. This should be your number one priority, because if you do, if you move these bishops from the board, then all of your other pieces are going to be exploiting the light squares, and black isn't going to have a dark squared bishop to oppose them. So when your opponent has a certain color complex that's weak, you want to exchange the bishop of that same color, and then the strength of your knight and your other pieces is going to be emphasized. So remember positions like this. If your opponent moves his pawns to one color complex, then usually the corresponding color becomes weak. So as soon as black moves, let's say white in this position moves the pawn to b3, now all of these squares are weak, and obviously if black can plant a knight in here, then it can no longer be dislodged. Conversely, if white manages to get a knight into f6, h6 or b6 or c5 or wherever, it won't be black won't be able to remove it from the board. So remember that once you see a weak color complex, try to adjust your strategic plans accordingly. In this position, white has no weaknesses. As soon as the move b3 is played, you might base your whole attacking plan around these three weaknesses, and it might work. I'm not saying in this exact position, but so remember that whenever your opponent moves a pawn, coming back to the first position, whenever your opponent moves a pawn, some weaknesses have been created, and that's very important to remember. Now let's look at two example games. The first example is Petrosyan versus Enrique Mecking from Vaikanze 1971, and this is a very nice game which I wanted to use for an example. It was the Torre attack, d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, bishop g5, and in this position Mecking played queen to e8. And now if you think about weaknesses, what we just saw in the first two examples, when you see this pawn structure with pawns on h5, g6, f7, e6 and d5, it's obvious that the dark squares are weak. This square is weak, this square is weak, this square is weak, this square is weak, and g7 is weak as well. So black obviously has dark squared weaknesses. Conversely, white has light squared weaknesses around his king, but it's really hard for black to exploit that because his bishop is locked behind its own pawn chain. So it's okay to allow weaknesses if you have enough defenders or if your opponent is unable to attack them. Now looking at the first position once again, remember the plan. If your opponent has a defender of his weak squares, then you need to exchange it. So in this position, Tigran Petrosyan played a very simple move. He played bishop to g5, exchanging the defender. Removing the defender from the diagonal, let's say playing bishop f8, is a bad move because the bishop is inactive anyway. So there was nothing better to do. So in this position, Mecking played queen to d8, queen to f4, not exchanging immediately because now the bishop is pinned to the queen, rook to c8, rook to e3, getting the rook into play, and now bishop g5, and very importantly, h takes g5. And now he has even more control over the dark squares. Now that the defender is gone, can you imagine black defending the dark squares? I think it's really hard. Obviously, the rooks can't really do a good job because the pawns are defending the squares. The light squared bishop isn't doing anything. The knight will have a really hard time getting into play. The queen is basically the only defender, and the king. And now look at how Tigran Petrosyan exploited the weaknesses. He is known to be one of the best positional players in history, and this game is a great example of that. He now has a very small advantage. The engines will give this position as not that much for white. Better, but not winning. But the way he played it gave Enrique Mecking no chance. Rook a8 was played here, and black basically has no moves. And now, this move might be surprising, but to emphasize the dark squared weaknesses even more, to weaken the dark square complex even more, he trades off the only good defender. Queen f6 check. Queen takes f6, e takes f6. Now, after king to h7, it's almost impossible to defend the dark squares. And now, compare the pieces. Firstly, the pawn structure is of course bad for white because his bishop is behind its pawn chain. If you compare this bishop to this knight, they are, I would say, equally active. The knight has many good squares, but the bishop can trade it off if the knight wanders around too much. The rooks are equal, neither side's rooks are that active. The most important thing in this position is this bishop versus this knight. And all of this is allowed by black weakening his dark squares too much and white exploiting it perfectly. So what Petrosyan did, he exchanged both defenders of the dark squared complex, the bishop and the queen, and now he is about to harass black until he resigns. King to g2, rook a to e8, f4, locking down the dark squares even more. A plan with knight to f3, knight here is going to be played, but Petrosyan is Petrosyan, and after rook a8 he plays f4, just not giving a single glimmer of hope to black that he is ever going to play the move e5. Rook to b8, rook e to e1, knight to b7, rook to h1. Petrosyan isn't in a hurry, of course. King to g8, knight to f3, getting into this square, knight d6, knight e5. And the thing is that whenever the black knight wanders into white's position, white is just able to trade it off. Because now white has all his pawns on dark squares, as we mentioned, so the light squares are weak, but white has a light squared bishop. So since black has weak dark squares and no dark squared bishop, it's really hard for him to play this position, and it's really easy for white. I'm just going to show you the game until the end. Now the win is pretty simple. Bishop e8, even though white would never trade that bishop. Bishop d3, rook c8, king to f3, and now this is the best part. Look at what Petrosyan does with his king. Bishop c6, rook to h2, bishop e8, king to e3, rook c7, king to d4. The dark squares are so weak and black is so impotent in fighting on the dark squares that white is actually able to march his king up the board, and there is absolutely nothing black can do. White is using his piece as his king as one of his best attacking pieces, and this is just over now. Black has no moves. Knight b7 was tried, b4 stopping any glimmer of counterplay once again. Knight c5 was tried by macking, but now if takes just takes, and the knight has no squares. So knight to d8 trying to read out, rook to h4, perhaps going for this move. Knight b7, rook to a2. You can see that making is just repeating moves, and Petrosyan is getting ready. Knight to d6, staring at these weaknesses once again, but white has light squared complex which is weak, but he has a bishop. That's the main difference. This game is a perfect example of weak color complexes. Rook h1, knight b7, b5, and he's taking his time. He's slowly maneuvering into the weaknesses. I really don't like the move b5 because it weakens the c5 square, but he had something specific in mind. After knight to c5, he now plays bishop to c2, allows the knight in here and still controls all the weaknesses, and there is nothing making can do. Knight d7, rook a3, knight c5, c4, finally opening up the position, knight d7, rook c3, and he is now ready to bust open the position and to just win. Now once again, look at the dark squared weaknesses, look at the king, and here after rook h to c1, h4, black just gave up and resigned. So once again, let's go back to the original position. After queen to e8, you can see that black's pawn chain is weakening the dark squared complex. So what do? Exchange the bishops. Bishop g5. Here, after rook to a8, the only defender of the dark squares is the queen. Exchange it off. Queen takes, e takes. And now, after king to h7, the task was pretty simple. f4, knight to f3, knight to e5, and harass black. After you move your last pawn here, your bishop is still defending the weaknesses, and then he even marched his king up the board to the d4 square and played a king up. In the second example, I wanted to show you how black in this position voluntarily weakened his squares. This is a game between Ahmed Adli and Viktor Laznitska from 2007 from the World Junior Championship. And in this position, your pawn is attacked. Obviously, the d5 pawn is attacked, and it's hard to defend. So in this position, Laznitska went for a concession. He played the move d4, the only way to defend the pawn. But now, this is the start of tremendous harassment on the dark squares. Okay, knight to d5. looking at the queen and at the bishop. Queen to d7, knight to d2. Now the knight is defended, of course. Knight to b4, and he doesn't really want to exchange his knight for this stupid knight on b4. So knight takes e7, bishop takes g2, knight f5, a tactical trade, bishop d5, knight to e4. Okay, after knight to e4, black plays king to f8, defending his weaknesses. a3, removing the knight, knight c6, queen to h5. And now, after d3, trying to get something with his passed pawn, knight to f6, you can see what white is trying to do. Let's go back. In this position, black no longer has a dark squared bishop, that's obvious. That means that any dark squared weaknesses are going to be more significant. For now, he still hasn't provoked this pawn to g6. Obviously, white would love for black to play this move, because then he has a check and then he has dark squared weaknesses. He wanted to provoke that so badly that he played the move knight to f6. After knight to f6, he is attacking the queen. He can take here with check, and black is in a lot of trouble, so gf6 is almost forced. And now look at the exploitation. Now in this position, of course, white has sacrificed a piece, so he has to play aggressively. Queen h6 check, using the dark squared weaknesses. King to g8, e takes f6. Look at the dark squares. Okay, so the pawns are on light squares, dark squared weaknesses. He removed the defender, the dark squared bishop, which was on e7. Rook to e8 was played as a defensive try. Bishop to f4, coming into the dark squares. Rook to c8, bishop to d6. Look at this domination. There is nothing white can do. The dark squares are so weak that white is completely winning. After knight c to d4, queen g7 check was played, and black just gave up. This is just impossible. And if you're wondering what happens if knight takes, it's pretty bad. And if knight takes, pawn takes, and white is going to win the game. Let me just show you this position. If knight takes here, then this is a mate in 1, and if pawn takes, then still oh sorry, no, there's this. Okay, yeah, sorry, the pawn takes doesn't work, so we have a mate in 1. So anyway, dark squares were so weak, the complex was so weakened that, okay, he had this nice finish with knight to h6 check, but regardless of that, his position is completely winning, and there is nothing black can do, and there is no way for him to contest the dark squares because he no longer has a defender. So coming back to the original position, I'm going to go a bit farther here after d5. Knight to d5 was a crucial maneuver, of course, attacking both the defenders of the dark squares. After queen d7, knight d2, knight b4, knight takes c7, removing the defender, and now he already had ideas of weakening these squares. Bishop takes g2, knight f5, knight d5, knight e4, getting both of his knights into play. King f8, a3, chasing the knight away, knight c6, queen to h5, getting the queen around the king. And now after d3, the crucial move to provoke huge weaknesses was knight to f6. Now I'm not saying that you should be sacrificing pieces to provoke weaknesses on a certain color complex. I'm just saying that that weakening squares badly enough could mean the end of the game for your opponent. So let's go back to the first position here. Okay, so whenever you move a pawn, remember that you are creating weaknesses. If your opponent moves his pawns around his king, especially because that's the scariest part, then you can often have a deadly attack. Regardless of his king's safety, if he moves the pawns on one side of the board or in the center, then the corresponding squares are going to be weak, and you can often find outposts, and you can often dominate your opponent positionally because he created those weaknesses. Okay, I hope that you are going to think before you move a pawn next time, and try to consider what kind of weaknesses are you creating. If you move this pawn, if you move two pawns to the same color, is your complex going to be weak? And always try to notice these weaknesses if your opponent plays such moves to make sure you can exploit them. Remember the plan of removing the defender of the weak squares and all of the defenders of the weak squares, and try to mount an attack on the colors, on the color which is weak. Okay, everybody, I hope you liked the video. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.